birds of a feather with one stone are worth two in the bush. Sadly, at least for me, it's the last month for one-page rules Beastmen releases. But that also means one of the units I was most excited for is finally here. The Harpies. These sleek and dynamic models are the beast version of birds, which means lots and lots of feathers. But they're not the only thing we see feathers on when it comes to models. So following the tradition I've been doing for Beastmen, I'm going to be showing off an easy way to paint feathers, and a more advanced, but still quite speedy way, along with a couple of variations on colors to get some natural or interesting looking birdmen. So nothing too advanced with this one, like painting feathers individually, which I have done before. Though this will be the beginner method, it's going to contain more than a single technique. And I know that might be a bit scary, but what I do want to show is that you can combine some really simple techniques that aren't that hard individually to create something that can look really amazing. For it, we'll need just a few colors. I'm going to use a raw umber and some white, but any light brown in your collection would work. A brown wash or ink, Argrax Earthshade is what I have in mind for mine, but a thinned contrast or ink with medium will work too. And a light or pale yellow. Some yellow into white works, but I know a lot of sets come with some pale yellows too, so that could save a step. For me, since I'll be mixing my colors, I'm going to start with some raw umber and a white as a base coat. Not too bright, but enough to get a good middle ground between them. I want to start with something light but opaque, because I want good coverage and something that the shade will show up on. To that end, I also started with a gray base coat, so it won't take too much effort to get that nice coverage. Next step will be a wash, continuing with my large brush and my Argrax Earthshade. If you're a true beginner, it's fine to just wash this over the whole model, but if you're up to trying something on the way to wet blending, this is the safe way to do it. I'll get some water, thinner or medium, and spread it out over the wing on the area I want to keep a lighter shade. And while it's still wet, start adding the Argrax Earthshade or the wash on the top of the wing. Then blend it into the medium so that as it gets lower, it dilutes out the pigment a bit, and we end up with a graded wash where it's darker on one side and gently fades off. I repeat this a couple of times after it dries each time, so it gets much darker on one side than the other. With such a textured surface, this is a prime place to do some dry brushing. But like the last step, there's a tiny bit of an advanced thing we can do to make it a little nicer without a jump in skill needed. Though again, if you're just a beginner, an overall dry brush in a lighter color is totally fine. But like the wash, I can do a bit of a blend, starting with only a slightly lighter color than the base coat, achieved by adding the pale yellow instead of white. I can dry brush the darker parts of the shaded area along the wing. Then with just the pure pale yellow, dry brush the less shaded tips of the wing very gently. And I don't need to push hard on the model with this jump in contrast. So that just leaves the middle now, and with a mix of the first dry brush and the last one, dry brush this median color between the other two. So I end up with not only a graded shade, but also a graded highlight. And the only thing that changed was the colors, never the techniques. The advanced method has quite a few of the same ideas, blending along the wings, just done with a bit more advanced but similar techniques. For the colors, I'll be switching some out for more paints, starting with sliding the wash out for a burnt umber instead, since I'll need something more pigmented for the base coat. Any sort of dark brown should work, just make sure it's a little different hue than the other browns so we get a bit of a color shift. And add some black to the palette too for a few smaller, darker details. This time I'll be going over a black primer, as with these browns it's just better for keeping darks dark. I'll do two base coats. The first will be the pure burnt umber over the top edges of the wings and along the bottoms of the leg feathers. The rest of the wings get the same base as the simple version, the raw umber with some white, to make it brighter but still saturated. Since it's over black this time, it might need a few coats, but I'm not going to worry if it's not that solid since my next step corrects that. Because like I wet blended with the wash, this time I'm going to wet blend proper, setting up my colors on the palette by just adding some retarder medium so they'll stay wet a little bit longer. To do the wet blend, the idea is the same as with the wash, but instead of a clear coat, I start with a coat of both colors on opposite sides, where I originally based them. Then while they're still wet, with a large brush, I'll start to bring them together in the middle. I find the best way is to usually start by pulling the dark down a bit into the light, and then spreading that light mix back up into the dark again. I'll also let you in on a little secret about wet blending, and it's one that can oftentimes discourage. But the first wet blended layer never looks good. It's not that I did it wrong, it's just how it is. So I have to do the same process over again once it's fully dry. The second one should really blend all those transitions together nicely until I've got a dark to light gradient on the wing. That takes care of the overall look of the wing, but now I want to add a bit of individuality to each feather. And I know that sounds like it'd be a whole lot of work, but actually it's not too bad. I've got two pools of color here, so I'm going to lighten them both up with my pale yellow. The burnt umber being on the red side will end up more orange, while the raw umber, already lightened with white, will come out a bit more yellow. The trick here is going to be brush tip blending. By only taking a tiny dab of the paint on the tip of a clean brush that holds its shape, I can start by putting this lighter color on the tip of a feather and fading it out as it's swished down. The reason I did the two different colors is to maintain the lightness that's already there in the blend. The raw umber and yellow mix being used to cover only the darker feathers, and the rest getting highlighted by the more yellow mix. And the good part about this is it's reversible too. If you find that it's getting too bright near the base of the feathers, by taking a dab of the original color that was in the shadows, it can be blended the same way from the back of the feather to the tip. Just try not to channel your inner perfectionist going back and forth, or the original gradient will be lost. The last thing I want to do is add spice and pepper to the feathers, which is why I grabbed the black, adding it and some of the burnt umber together for a very dark brown. Then using a really fine brush, I'm just going to add some stray fibers around the feathers. Nothing uniform about it, just picking random spots to place a stripe. Though when I find a spot, I do have to follow the grain of the feather. The first feather color palette I want to tackle is for crow feathers. And I know what the thought might be, black and white bud, black and white. But I want to see if I can get a whole myriad of colors into a nice iridescent crow feather. So while I need those white and black, I'm also going to need a red shade blue, in this case my ultramarine, some green, and some red. And if you have those colors in ink form, even better. But normal paints will work too. When I prime black, it's never a true black, because it's easier for the camera to pick up details if I have a few drops of gray in with the black. But in this case, that's actually what I want to start my base color from. So if you have pure black as your base coat, start with a base coat of a really dark gray over it. The reason for that is I want to make some gradients at this point, and I want my shadows to be pure black. And I figured the easiest way to do that is to do the reverse brush point blending I did with the advanced version, but with black against the base of each feather layer. This should give me a really soft gradient from pure black to something a bit lighter. On top of that, I'm also going to use a lighter gray to lighten up the tips of individual feathers. Most of this is just preparation for the colors getting added in a little bit, but would also be how I do black and white versions of a crow feather. Now for the iridescent colors. I found a really nice reference image that has them with a bit of a red sheen, so that's where I'm going to start. And I'm going to make this really easy on myself by using my airbrush. With just a couple of drops of my matte medium and a tiny bit of red ink in a brush, I make a mix. Then just in the middle of the feathers, slowly build up some very light and translucent reds to tint those feathers ever so slightly. I kept the red to the center of the wing because I want to colorize the edges with some complementary colors that are completely different. The first is the red shade blue. Ultramarine is good for this because it itself is also really transparent. I'll also use just a tiny bit of the red ink to red shift it even more to that slightly purple territory. Then just along the top edge of the feather like I did with the red. The last color will be green, using a green ink to keep things translucent, but also adding a bit of the red just so it harmonizes a bit better as well. This gets a light thin layer on the bottom side of the overall wing, just along a small strip to complete the color shifted wings. If everything goes right, what I should have is some dark, but not too dark wings, with just a hint of each color blending and changing from the top of the wing to the base. I'll need pretty much all my reds for this. Burnt Umber, Chimera Red Oxide, Liquitex Red Oxide, and a saturated primary red, whatever most vibrant, as well as a black and white, and maybe a yellow in case I need to lighten some things, plus a blue for a bit of color shifting. Because as this may be my last Beastman I paint for a video, I want to see if I can make some interesting feathers using the method shown to get something that'll match the demonic fur I was going for on some of these furred beasts. I figure I just don't want to paint red feathers and leave it at that, so I think what I'll do is start from a reddish brown and transition into the earth reds the same way I went from dark brown to light brown using wet blending. I'm going with a mix of both of my red oxides as the lighter color, because it's much more opaque than a primary red, so will show up much better over my black undercoat. The other thing it'll let me do is save the naphtha red for the wingtips. For the darker feathers, I'll mix it with the brown so it doesn't get too vibrant on those ones, but for the lighter red, I want to get as vibrant as I can, so use just the pure naphtha red. And since red is just that transparent, I might have to go over each wingtip a couple of times, but that makes the method I'm using a little more relaxed, the brush tip blending, because even if I put too much, it will always easily blend into the layer under it. I want to get some of those irregularities into the feathers as well, but I don't think going dark is the way, because with the fur I went light. In this case, that's what the yellow is for, a yellow oxide, so it's opaque with just a touch of red to make it a bit more orange. Then with my finest but not too small brush, add some random strands along the grains of the feather again. Just something to make points stand out and look a little bit realistic for a demonic wing. The last thing I really like to do to sell a color is to apply a thin glaze of another color into either the shadows or just on a singular side to add accent and hue differences. That's why I included the blue in the palette, so I can just add a thin layer to some of the shaded areas to get that color change, not even mixing in any red, because the easiest way to apply a glaze like that is with an airbrush. Just a small even layer aimed at the shadows will blend on the model as the red is reflected through the blue. The key to a good looking wing is some color variation. This even works for demonic or bat wings. By making them one solid color, it can end up looking a little too flat for such a large area, but by adding a darker shade or another color entirely, the wings become the centerpiece they were made to be. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one, or just other fun things to do with painting miniatures. And until next time, enjoy your own painting journey.